She stood frozen in the doorway, her white wedding dress still perfect, her veil still pinned in place. The hotel hallway was quiet now. Most of the guests had gone home. The music had stopped. But through that barely opened door, she heard something that made her heart stop. A voice she knew, a laugh she trusted. And in that single moment, everything she believed about her life, her family, and the man she'd just married crumbled into dust. Some doors should never be opened. But on her wedding night, she opened one, and what she saw didn't just break her heart. It destroyed every memory she thought was safe, every person she thought she could trust, and every dream she'd built for her future. This is not a story about a simple affair. This is about betrayal that was years in the making, hidden behind prayers and Sunday dinners, disguised as love and protection. Stay with me until the end, because what she discovered later, the truth that had been carefully buried beneath smiles and family photos, was far more devastating than what she saw that night. Who was the groom really? A man of faith, respected in the community, the answer to her prayers? Or someone who had been playing a role from the very beginning? Why was her foster mother there that night, in that room, at that moment? The woman who had raised her, who had wiped her tears, who had walked her down the aisle just hours before. How long had the secret been hiding? Days? Months? Or had it been there all along, woven into every family dinner, every holiday, every moment she thought was genuine? And why did no one warn her? Were there others who knew? People who smiled at the wedding, who toasted to their happiness, who watched her walk toward a truth they all protected. They smiled for the wedding photos. They prayed together before the ceremony. They danced as family while the DJ played her favorite songs. But behind one closed door, a truth was waiting. A truth that would make her question everything she thought she knew about loyalty, about love, about the very people who were supposed to protect her. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Sarah, and her story began the way so many foster children's stories begin, with loss. She was 7 years old when she entered the system, after her biological mother's rights were terminated due to addiction. She bounced between 3 homes in 2 years, each one promising stability, each one falling apart for different reasons. Then, at 9 years old, she met Margaret. Margaret was different from the other foster parents. She was a widow in her early 50s, a woman who attended church every Sunday, who volunteered at the community center, who seemed to genuinely care. Margaret didn't just provide a bed and meals. She showed up at school plays. She helped with homework. She listened when Sarah had nightmares about her biological mother. For the first time in her young life, Sarah felt like she belonged somewhere. Margaret never formally adopted Sarah, but she didn't need to. Sarah called her mom. She spent holidays with Margaret's extended family. She learned to bake Margaret's famous pecan pie. She felt safe. As Sarah grew into her teenage years, and then into young adulthood, Margaret remained her anchor. When Sarah struggled in college, Margaret encouraged her. When Sarah doubted herself, Margaret reminded her of her strength. When Sarah wondered if she'd ever have a real family of her own, Margaret promised her that love would find her when the time was right. And then, at 26 years old, Sarah met Daniel. He was 32, a project manager at a construction company, soft-spoken and thoughtful. They met at Margaret's church during a community outreach event. Daniel had recently moved to town for work, and he'd been attending services for a few months. Margaret introduced them after a Sunday service, mentioning that Daniel was new to the area and could use some friends. Sarah noticed how kind he seemed, how he spoke gently to the elderly church members, how he stayed after to help stack chairs. They started talking, first at church events, then over coffee, then during long walks through the park near Margaret's house. Daniel seemed almost too good to be true. He asked about her childhood with genuine interest, never making her feel pitiful for having been in foster care. He shared his own story of growing up with a single father who'd worked 2 jobs. He talked about wanting to build a family, about valuing loyalty and commitment. He treated Margaret with deep respect, often stopping by her house to help with repairs or yard work. Margaret loved him. She'd pull Sarah aside and say things like, "That man is an answer to prayer," or "He's exactly the kind of husband you deserve." Within a year, Daniel proposed. It was simple and perfect, during a sunset at the same park where they'd had their first real conversation. Sarah said yes, without hesitation. The wedding planning brought Sarah and Margaret even closer. They picked out flowers together, tasted cakes, addressed invitations side by side at Margaret's kitchen table. Sarah had no biological family to invite, but Margaret made sure the church community filled every seat. Margaret walked Sarah down the aisle, tears streaming down her face, whispering, "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart." The ceremony was beautiful. The vows were heartfelt. Daniel's hands shook slightly as he slid the ring onto Sarah's finger. The reception was held at a modest hotel conference room, decorated with white lights and wildflowers. Sarah danced with Daniel, then with Margaret, then with friends from college and church. Everyone told her she looked radiant. Everyone said they'd never seen her happier. And she was happy, deliriously, completely happy. She thought she'd finally found what she'd been searching for her entire life, a real family, a safe place, a love that wouldn't abandon her. She had no idea that the foundation she was standing on was already cracked, that the people she trusted most had built her happiness on a lie. She didn't know that the man holding her hand had secrets that predated their first conversation, or that the woman who raised her had played a role in bringing him into her life for reasons Sarah couldn't have imagined. She thought she was marrying into safety. She didn't know she was walking into a carefully hidden storm, one that had been gathering strength long before she ever said yes. The reception ended around 11. Guests hugged Sarah and Daniel goodbye, offering final congratulations before heading home. Margaret kissed Sarah on the forehead and whispered, "Be happy, baby girl. You deserve this." Sarah and Daniel were staying at the same hotel where the reception had been held, in a suite on the 3rd floor. It was a small luxury, something Daniel had insisted on. "We'll start our marriage right," he'd said with a smile. By midnight, they were alone. Daniel suggested they change out of their formal clothes and order room service, maybe watch a movie before bed. Sarah agreed. She went into the bathroom to carefully remove her veil and slip out of her wedding dress. She could hear the television click on in the other room, Daniel flipping through channels. But after a few minutes, she realized the sound had stopped. She called out to him, asking if he'd decided on a movie. No answer. She called again. Still nothing. Sarah stepped out of the bathroom in her robe, her hair still pinned up, and found the suite empty. The television was off. Daniel's jacket was gone from the chair where he'd draped it. Her first thought was that maybe he'd gone down to the lobby for ice or a late-night snack from the vending machine. She texted him, "Where'd you go?" and waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. No response. A small knot of worry formed in her stomach. It was their wedding night. Why would he leave without saying anything? She slipped on her shoes and stepped into the hallway, thinking maybe she'd just go find him, make sure everything was okay. The hotel corridor was dimly lit and silent, most of the rooms dark behind closed doors. She walked toward the elevator, then paused. She heard something. Voices. Quiet, but distinct. Coming from a room just down the hall. One of the voices was Daniel's. She'd recognize it anywhere. The other voice made her stop breathing. It was Margaret's. Sarah's mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Why would Margaret still be here? She'd left the reception over an hour ago. Why would she be in a hotel room with Daniel? Maybe there was an emergency. Maybe something had happened. Sarah walked toward the sound, her heart pounding. The door to the room was slightly ajar, just a crack of light spilling into the hallway. She pushed it open slowly, not wanting to startle them if something was wrong. And then she saw. She didn't scream. She didn't faint. She didn't even move. Her body simply froze, her mind trying to process what her eyes were seeing. Daniel and Margaret, not standing apart in conversation, not sitting in chairs discussing some urgent matter. Together, close, in a way that made the room spin around Sarah. Margaret's hand was on Daniel's face. His arms were around her waist. Their foreheads were touching, their eyes closed, their bodies speaking a language Sarah had never imagined between them. Then Daniel opened his eyes. He saw Sarah in the doorway. His face went white. He stepped back immediately, his hands dropping. Margaret turned, and for a split second, Sarah saw something in her foster mother's eyes that she couldn't name. Guilt? Fear? Something else? Daniel said her name. Sarah. Just that. Her name, spoken like a plea. Margaret straightened her blouse, her expression shifting into something Sarah had never seen before, defensive, almost cold. "This isn't what it looks like," Daniel started, his voice shaking. But Sarah couldn't hear the rest. There was a ringing in her ears, a pressure in her chest. She took one step backward, then another. Her hand found the doorframe, steadying herself. She looked at Margaret, the woman who had raised her, who had loved her, who had walked her down the aisle just hours ago. How long? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Margaret didn't answer. Daniel moved toward Sarah, reaching out, but she flinched away. How long? She asked again, louder this time, her voice cracking. Daniel's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Margaret, as if asking permission to speak. That look, that single glance between them, told Sarah everything she needed to know. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was something that had history, depth, familiarity. Margaret finally spoke, but what she didn't know yet, what she would discover in the days and weeks to come, was that this was not the first time. This was not a sudden mistake or a tragic error in judgment. This was a pattern, a secret, a relationship that had existed long before Sarah ever met Daniel, long before Margaret ever introduced them at church, long before Sarah believed she was building a life with a man who loved her. She simply understood, sitting there alone in her wedding dress still hanging in the bathroom, that her life before this moment was over. The family she thought she had, the trust she'd spent years building, the love she thought was real, all of it had been a carefully constructed illusion. And she had been the only one who didn't know. If you're still watching, comment, "I'm still here," because what happens next will change everything you think you understand about this story. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat in that hotel suite until the sun came up, still wearing her robe, her wedding dress hanging untouched in the bathroom like a ghost of what should have been. Daniel knocked on the door 3 times. The first time around 2 in the morning, his voice desperate through the wood. "Sarah, please. Let me explain. Please." She didn't move. The second time around 4, quieter, almost defeated. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." She stared at the door, but said nothing. The third time at dawn, he didn't speak at all. He just stood there. She could see his shadow under the door. After 10 minutes, he left. By 7 in the morning, Sarah packed her small overnight bag, left her wedding dress hanging in the closet, and walked out of the hotel through a side entrance. She drove to her apartment, the one she'd planned to give up in a few weeks since she and Daniel were supposed to move into a house together. She sat in her car in the parking lot for an hour before finally going inside. Her phone had been buzzing all morning. 12 missed calls from Daniel. 7 from Margaret. Text messages piling up. She turned off her phone and pulled the curtains closed. For 3 days, Sarah barely moved. She called in sick to work. She didn't answer the door when friends stopped by to check on her, worried they hadn't heard from the newlywed. She existed in a fog, her mind cycling through the same questions over and over. How long had it been going on? When did it start? Did Margaret introduce them on purpose? Was the entire relationship planned? Did Daniel ever actually love her? Or was she just part of some sick arrangement she couldn't yet understand? On the 4th day, Margaret showed up at Sarah's apartment and wouldn't leave. She knocked for 15 minutes straight, calling through the door. "Sarah, baby, please. We need to talk. Please let me in." Finally, Sarah opened the door. Not because she wanted to talk, but because she wanted Margaret to stop calling her baby, stop pretending they still had the relationship they'd had before. Margaret looked exhausted. Her eyes were red, her hair uncombed, her clothes wrinkled. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in 4 days. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation and immediately started talking, her words rushing out. "It's not what you think. I know how it looked, but it's complicated, Sarah. Daniel and I, we have a history, but it's not like you're imagining. We care about each other, yes, but I encouraged him to marry you because I thought you two would be good together. I thought you deserved him." Sarah felt nauseous. "You thought I deserved him? Your what, boyfriend? Your lover? You thought I deserved your leftovers?" Margaret flinched. "Don't say it like that. It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" Sarah's voice was ice. "Explain it to me, Mom. Make me understand how the woman who raised me could do this." Margaret's face crumpled. She tried to reach for Sarah's hand, but Sarah pulled away. "I never meant for you to get hurt," Margaret said, tears now streaming down her face. "I love you, Sarah. You have to believe that. Everything I did because I love you." "You don't destroy someone you love," Sarah said quietly. "You don't hand them over to someone you're sleeping with and call it a gift." Margaret tried several more times to explain, to justify, to minimize. She claimed the physical relationship with Daniel had ended months before he and Sarah got serious. She insisted she'd stepped back to give them space. She said she genuinely believed Daniel would be a good husband, that she'd wanted Sarah to be happy. But her explanations only made it worse. Every word confirmed that Margaret had known from the beginning. She had watched Sarah fall in love. She had helped plan the wedding. She had smiled through every moment, knowing she was lying. After an hour, Sarah asked Margaret to leave. "I don't want to see you again," Sarah said. "Don't call me. Don't come here. Don't try to fix this. Sarah, please. I'm your mother." "No," Sarah said, her voice breaking for the first time. "A mother wouldn't do this. A mother would protect me, not use me. You're not my mother. You never were." Margaret left sobbing. Sarah closed the door and collapsed. 2 days later, Daniel finally got through to her. He showed up at her workplace during her lunch break, waiting by her car. She tried to walk past him, but he blocked her path gently. "5 minutes," he said. "Please, just give me 5 minutes." Against her better judgment, Sarah agreed. They sat in his car in the parking lot, and Daniel talked. He admitted the relationship with Margaret had started 2 years before he met Sarah. He'd been attending Margaret's church, and they connected over coffee after a service. Margaret was lonely. He was new in town. It had started as friendship and evolved into something more. When he and Sarah began talking, he claimed he'd tried to end things with Margaret. He said Margaret had encouraged him to pursue Sarah, telling him it was time to move on, to build a real future with someone his own age. He insisted he'd fallen in love with Sarah genuinely, that his feelings for her were real, separate from whatever he'd had with Margaret. "Then why were you with her on our wedding night?" Sarah asked, her voice hollow. Daniel looked down. "She texted me during the reception, said she needed to talk, that it was urgent. I thought something was wrong. When I got to her room, she was upset, crying, saying she'd made a mistake encouraging us, that she still had feelings for me. I was trying to comfort her. I swear, Sarah, nothing happened. You walked in before anything happened." "But it would have," Sarah said. "If I hadn't walked in, something would have happened." "Right." Daniel didn't answer. His silence was answer enough. "Did you ever actually love me?" Sarah asked. "Or was I just the acceptable choice? The one you were supposed to pick?" "I love you," Daniel said, his voice desperate. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But I love you, Sarah. We can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can work through it." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and felt nothing. No love, no anger, just emptiness. "You married me on the same day you were planning to be with her," Sarah said. "You stood in front of everyone we know and promised to be faithful, and hours later, you were in her room. That's not love, Daniel. I don't know what it is, but it's not love." She got out of the car and walked back to work. Daniel called and texted for weeks after. So did Margaret. So did several people from church, people Margaret had clearly talked to, people who urged Sarah to forgive, to think about reconciliation, to consider the family. One church elder even called to suggest Sarah was being too harsh, that marriages go through trials, that walking away wasn't the Christian thing to do. Sarah stopped answering calls from anyone connected to that church. She stopped going to the places she used to go, the coffee shop where she'd met Daniel, the park where he'd proposed, Margaret's house where she'd spent so many holidays. She felt like a ghost, haunting her own life, unable to fully inhabit it anymore. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the realization that everyone had expected her to absorb it, to forgive it, to protect the people who hurt her. They told her to be calm. They told her to think about Margaret's feelings, about Daniel's regret, about the importance of family. No one asked her how she would survive this. No one seemed to care that she was drowning. But Sarah wasn't drowning. Not anymore. She was angry. And anger, she was learning, could be fuel. 6 weeks after the wedding, Sarah received a Facebook message from a woman she didn't know. The woman's name was Jennifer, and her message was brief but devastating. "I don't know if you'll believe me, but I think you deserve to know the truth about Daniel and Margaret. Can we meet?" Sarah's first instinct was to delete it, to protect herself from whatever new pain was coming. But something in the message's tone, careful, sad, reluctant, made her respond. They met at a coffee shop across town, far from anywhere Sarah used to frequent. Jennifer was in her early 40s, neatly dressed, nervous. She ordered tea but didn't drink it. "I don't know how to say this," Jennifer began. "So I'm just going to say it. I was engaged to Daniel 3 years ago." Sarah's breath caught. Jennifer continued. "We dated for about a year. He was wonderful at first. Thoughtful, kind, everything you'd want. We got engaged, started planning a wedding. But about 2 months before the wedding, I started noticing things. He'd disappear for hours without explanation. He'd get secretive about his phone. I thought maybe he was having an affair with someone from work. She paused, her hands shaking slightly around her teacup. Then one night, I followed him. I'm not proud of it, but I had to know. He drove to a house in the suburbs. A woman answered the door. She was older, maybe in her 50s. They embraced, and it wasn't appropriate. I confronted him the next day. He broke down, admitted he'd been seeing this woman, an older woman from his church named Margaret. He said he had feelings for both of us, that he didn't know how to choose. Sarah felt the room tilt. Jennifer kept talking. I called off the wedding. I was humiliated, heartbroken. But here's the thing I found out later, from a mutual friend who attended that church. Margaret had introduced Daniel to me. She'd specifically suggested he ask me out. The friend said Margaret had a pattern. She'd date younger men from the church. Then when things got too serious or people started noticing, she'd push them toward younger women, women she could control or influence. She'd stay close to the relationships, inserting herself as the caring elder, the mentor. And apparently, she'd done this before I met Daniel, with at least one other guy. Sarah couldn't breathe. When I saw your wedding announcement online, with Margaret in the family photos, I felt sick, Jennifer said. I almost reached out then, but I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe Daniel had changed. Then I saw your relationship status change back to single a few weeks ago, and I knew. I knew he'd done it again. Sarah sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Everything suddenly made horrifying sense. The way Margaret had been so enthusiastic about introducing her to Daniel. The way she'd pushed them together, encouraged every step of their relationship. The way Daniel had always been so deferential to Margaret, checking with her about decisions, seeking her approval. Margaret hadn't just betrayed Sarah in the moment Sarah walked in on them. She'd set up the entire relationship. Sarah had been chosen not as Daniel's true love, but as his acceptable cover, a younger woman he could marry to make his relationship with Margaret look respectable, to deflect suspicion, to give Margaret continued access to him through the disguise of family connection. There's more, Jennifer said quietly. After I called off my engagement, I did some digging. Margaret was a foster parent, right? Sarah nodded, numb. I found out she'd had her foster license investigated twice. Once about 8 years ago, and once about 5 years ago. Both times, teenage boys in her care had made complaints. Nothing explicitly illegal, but concerning enough that the state looked into it. Inappropriate boundaries, they called it. Too much physical affection. Blurred lines between maternal care and something else. Nothing was ever proven, but her license was put on probationary status both times. Sarah felt bile rise in her throat. The woman who had raised her, who she'd called Mom, had a documented history of inappropriate behavior. And Sarah had never known. No one had ever told her. Why are you telling me this? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Because I spent 2 years wondering if I was crazy, Jennifer said. Wondering if I'd overreacted, if I'd thrown away a good man because of jealousy or insecurity. I let Margaret and Daniel's version of events make me doubt my own reality. I don't want that to happen to you. What they did to you, what they did to both of us, it wasn't normal. It wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. And you deserve to know that you weren't wrong to walk away. The two women sat together for another hour, sharing stories, comparing timelines. Every detail Jennifer shared matched something Sarah had experienced. The way Daniel would defer to Margaret on decisions. The way Margaret would show up uninvited to their dates early on, just to check in. The way both of them had insisted on keeping certain aspects of their past private, claiming it was about moving forward, not dwelling on old relationships. Sarah left that coffee shop with a clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. She wasn't betrayed by accident. She wasn't the victim of a moment of weakness or a complicated situation that got out of hand. She was chosen to be deceived. Deliberately. Carefully. By two people who had done this before and would likely do it again. That night, Sarah sat down and wrote everything out. Every detail Jennifer had shared. Every inconsistency she'd noticed in her own relationship. Every moment that hadn't quite made sense. She wasn't writing it for revenge or to expose them publicly. She was writing it to make sense of her own story, to see the pattern clearly, to stop doubting herself. She had spent 6 weeks wondering if she'd overreacted, if she should have tried harder to understand, if forgiveness was the right path. Now she knew. Some things don't deserve forgiveness. Some betrayals are too calculated, too deliberate, too rooted in patterns of manipulation to be excused. She had been used. Not loved. Used. And the woman who had claimed to be her mother, who had claimed every decision was made out of love for Sarah, had been the architect of the entire deception. Margaret had raised her not to protect her, but to control her. To have someone loyal, someone trusting, someone who could be offered up to Margaret's boyfriends as the respectable choice when the secret relationship got too risky. Sarah had been groomed, not for her own benefit, but to serve Margaret's needs. The revelation was almost too big to absorb. But as Sarah sat with it, as she let the truth settle into her bones, something shifted. The shame she'd been carrying, the humiliation, the sense that somehow she should have seen it coming, all of it began to lift. This wasn't her failure. This was never about her not being enough or not being worthy. This was about two people who had used her trust as a weapon against her. And now, she was done being their victim. Sarah filed for an annulment 3 months after the wedding. In her state, she qualified on the grounds of fraud, that Daniel had entered the marriage with undisclosed ongoing ties to another person that directly affected the validity of the marriage commitment. Daniel didn't contest it. Perhaps he knew he had no ground to stand on, or perhaps even he felt some measure of guilt for what he'd done. The annulment was granted. Legally, it was as if the marriage had never happened. Emotionally, Sarah knew that wasn't true. The marriage had happened. The betrayal had happened. The loss of trust, the shattering of her sense of family, the destruction of years of memories with Margaret, all of it had happened and left scars. But Sarah was learning to see those scars not as marks of her weakness, but as evidence of her strength. She had survived. She had chosen truth over comfort, freedom over false peace. Cutting ties with Margaret was harder than leaving Daniel. Margaret tried everything. Letters, voicemails, showing up at Sarah's work, sending mutual friends to plead her case. She cycled through every emotion: anger, bargaining, self-pity, righteous indignation. In one letter, Margaret wrote that Sarah was being cruel and unforgiving, that she was throwing away years of love over one mistake. In another, she claimed Sarah had always been jealous of her relationship with Daniel, that Sarah was twisting the situation to make herself the victim. Sarah read the letters once, then threw them away. She didn't respond. She didn't engage. She had learned from Jennifer's story that Margaret was skilled at rewriting history, at making her victims doubt their own perceptions. Sarah refused to give her that power. She blocked Margaret's number. She blocked her on social media. She told the few friends they'd shared that she didn't want updates about Margaret's life, didn't want to hear that Margaret was sorry or hurting or asking about her. She needed a clean break, not for revenge, but for survival. 6 months after walking away, Sarah started therapy. She found a counselor who specialized in complex family trauma and betrayal. In those sessions, Sarah began to untangle the years of manipulation she'd endured, much of it so subtle she'd never recognized it as manipulation at all. The way Margaret had always positioned herself as Sarah's savior, the only person who'd ever truly loved her. The way Margaret had discouraged Sarah from getting too close to other friends or potential romantic partners until Daniel came along. The way Margaret had trained Sarah to prioritize Margaret's feelings, to always consider how her choices would affect Margaret, to feel guilty for any act of independence. Sarah had thought this was love. She thought this was what family looked like. Now she understood it was control. Therapy helped Sarah see that her worth wasn't tied to Margaret's approval or Daniel's choice. She had value independent of their betrayal. She had a right to anger, to boundaries, to walking away from people who hurt her, even if those people claimed to love her. 1 year after the wedding, Sarah moved to a different city. Not because she was running away, but because she wanted a fresh start in a place where no one knew her story, where she didn't have to carry the weight of being the girl whose foster mom slept with her husband. She found a new job, a small apartment with big windows, a neighborhood with coffee shops where she could sit and read without looking over her shoulder. She made new friends slowly, carefully. She was more guarded now, more careful with her trust. But she was also more honest. She told people about her past when it felt right, not with shame, but with clarity. "I come from a complicated family situation," she'd say. "I'm still learning how to trust. Please be patient with me." Most people were. The ones who weren't, Sarah let go of without guilt. She joined a support group for people who'd experienced family betrayal. There, She met others with similar stories, people whose parents had lied to them, used them, manipulated them in the name of love. Hearing their stories helped Sarah feel less alone. Sharing her own story helped her reclaim it. She wasn't just the woman who'd been betrayed. She was the woman who'd walked away. She was the woman who'd chosen herself. 2 years after the wedding that never should have happened, Sarah met someone new. His name was Marcus. He was kind, patient, honest to a fault. When she told him her story, he didn't try to minimize it or rush her past it. He just listened and then said, "Thank you for trusting me with that. I promise I'll never give you reason to regret it." She believed him. Not naively, not blindly, but with the earned trust that comes from watching someone's actions match their words over time. Marcus didn't push her. He let her set the pace. He met her trauma with gentleness and her boundaries with respect. Sarah knew she might never fully heal from what Margaret and Daniel had done. Some wounds don't close completely, but she also knew she was building something new, something real, on the foundation of truth rather than lies. She'd learned that some people raise you not to protect you, but to use your trust. She'd learned that loyalty without honesty is just another form of control. She'd learned that walking away from people who hurt you isn't weakness or unforgiveness. Sometimes it's the only way to save yourself. She'd learned that family isn't about blood or who raised you. It's about who shows up honestly, who respects your boundaries, who loves you without requiring you to diminish yourself. And she'd learned that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. Strong enough to see the truth. Strong enough to choose it, even when it was painful. Strong enough to walk away from everything familiar and build a life on her own terms. Sarah didn't know if Daniel and Margaret were still together. She didn't know if they'd found other victims or if Jennifer had been right about Margaret's pattern. She didn't spend time wondering. That was their story now, not hers. Her story was about reclaiming herself, about learning to trust again, carefully, about building a life where love didn't come with conditions, where safety didn't require her silence, where family meant something true. On the third anniversary of what would have been her wedding, Sarah did something she'd been planning for months. She wrote a letter to the social services department that had placed her with Margaret years ago. In it, she detailed everything she'd learned about Margaret's history, Jennifer's story, the pattern of inappropriate relationships with younger men, the use of foster children and men as cover for those relationships. She didn't know if anything would come of it. Margaret no longer had an active foster license, but Sarah wanted it on record. She wanted someone in the system to know that the woman who had seemed like such a perfect foster parent had actually been using that role for her own needs, grooming children to trust her so completely that they couldn't see when boundaries were crossed. "I'm writing this not for revenge," Sarah wrote in the letter, "but because I would have wanted someone to warn me. If there's any way this information can protect even one child from experiencing what I experienced, then it's worth sharing." She mailed the letter and felt a weight lift. She had done what she could. The rest was out of her hands. She had survived something that could have destroyed her. She had walked through the fire of betrayal, loss, and disillusionment. And she'd come out the other side not bitter, not broken, but clear-eyed and strong. Some doors should never be opened. But sometimes, opening them, seeing the truth behind them, is the only way to finally be free. So let me ask you, would you have been able to walk away like Sarah did? Or would the pressure from family, from community, from the people telling you to forgive, have kept you trapped in that situation? Comment below and let me know. Be honest. It's easy to say we'd leave when we're watching someone else's story. But when it's your life, your family, your foundation crumbling beneath you, the choice becomes so much harder. And here's another question. Was walking away strength or weakness? Some people would say Sarah should have fought for her marriage, that she gave up too easily, that real love requires forgiveness even in the face of deep betrayal. Other people would say walking away was the only self-respecting choice, that staying would have destroyed her. What do you think? Where's the line between forgiveness and self-abandonment? And one more question, maybe the most difficult one. Can betrayal ever truly come from love? Margaret claimed everything she did was because she loved Sarah. Daniel claimed he genuinely cared for Sarah, even while maintaining his relationship with Margaret. Do you believe love and betrayal can coexist? Or is that just manipulation disguised as love? I want to hear your thoughts. Comment below. Share your own experiences if you feel comfortable. This community is a place for honest conversation, for supporting each other through difficult truths. Your story matters. Your perspective matters. If this story shook you, if it made you think about your own relationships or your own boundaries, then it did exactly what it was meant to do. Stories like Sarah's aren't just entertainment. They're mirrors. They show us what we might not want to see in our own lives, the patterns we've ignored, the red flags we've explained away, the loyalty we've given to people who didn't deserve it. They challenge us to ask ourselves the hard questions. Am I in a relationship where I'm constantly making excuses for someone's behavior? Do I have people in my life who claim to love me, but consistently violate my trust? Am I staying in situations out of genuine love or out of fear, obligation, or guilt? Have I been taught that setting boundaries is selfish, that protecting myself is unforgiving, that speaking truth is disrespectful? These are the questions Sarah had to face. And maybe, after hearing her story, you're facing some of them too. Here's what I want you to understand. Sarah's strength didn't come from being unbreakable. It came from breaking and then choosing to rebuild on her own terms. She didn't walk away because it was easy. She walked away because staying would have required her to betray herself, to accept a version of love that was really just control, to live in a lie for the comfort of others. And that's a price she was no longer willing to pay. Some of you watching this might be in similar situations right now. Maybe not exactly like Sarah's, but close enough that her story is hitting too close to home. Maybe you have a parent or family member who uses your loyalty against you. Maybe you're in a relationship where things don't quite add up, where your partner's explanations never fully satisfy your gut instinct. Maybe you've been told to forgive and move on from something that fundamentally changed how safe you feel. If that's you, I want you to hear this. Your feelings are valid. Your boundaries matter. You are not obligated to maintain relationships with people who consistently hurt you, no matter what they call that relationship. Family, friendship, marriage. None of these titles give anyone permission to deceive you, manipulate you, or use your trust as a weapon. And if you're the person who stayed, who chose to work through betrayal, who rebuilt trust with someone who broke it, that's valid too. Every situation is different. Every person's capacity for forgiveness and reconciliation is different. There's no one-size-fits-all answer to how you should respond to betrayal. The key is that the choice has to be yours, made from a place of clarity and self-respect, not from pressure, fear, or the need to please others. Sarah's story teaches us that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is leave. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but in honest recognition that a relationship has become toxic, that the foundation was never as solid as you believed, that staying would cost you more than leaving ever could. It teaches us that closure doesn't always come from the other person's apology or explanation. Sometimes closure comes from simply deciding you're done, that you've given enough, that you deserve better. It teaches us that the people who truly love you will respect your boundaries, even when those boundaries exclude them. The people who manipulate you will call your boundaries cruel, will accuse you of being unforgiving, will try to make you feel guilty for protecting yourself. Let me tell you what happened after Sarah sent that letter to social services. About 6 months later, she received a response. The department had investigated her claims, cross-referenced them with Margaret's file history, and discovered additional complaints that had been filed over the years but never fully investigated. 3 other young women who had been in Margaret's care or mentorship had come forward after Sarah's letter prompted a reopened investigation. Their stories were similar: inappropriate emotional dependence, blurred boundaries, being pushed toward relationships with men Margaret was involved with. Margaret's ability to ever serve as a foster parent again was permanently revoked. The case was also referred to law enforcement, though Sarah never learned if any criminal charges were ultimately filed. She didn't need to know. She'd done what she could to protect others. The rest was out of her hands. When Sarah heard about the other women coming forward, she felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that she wasn't alone, that her experience had been validated. Sadness for what those other women had endured. Anger that the system had failed to connect the dots earlier, that so many warning signs had been ignored or explained away. But also, surprisingly, she felt pride. Pride that she'd spoken up. Pride that her willingness to tell the truth had given others permission to do the same. Pride that she'd transformed her pain into protection for others. As for Daniel, Sarah heard through a mutual acquaintance about a year after the annulment that he'd moved to another state. Whether he was still with Margaret or had moved on to someone else, Sarah didn't know and didn't ask. She'd created a life where his choices no longer affected her, where his presence or absence made no difference to her peace. That, she realized, was true freedom. Not the absence of pain from what he'd done, but the absence of his power to continue hurting her. And Margaret? Sarah occasionally wondered if Margaret ever truly understood what she'd done, if she ever took responsibility, if she ever stopped seeing herself as the victim of Sarah's cruelty and recognized herself as the perpetrator of genuine harm. Sarah doubted it. People like Margaret, people who'd spent years perfecting the art of manipulation, rarely saw themselves clearly. They were too invested in their own narratives, too skilled at reframing every situation to center their feelings, their needs, their version of events. But that wasn't Sarah's problem anymore. She'd stopped trying to make Margaret see the truth. She'd stopped hoping for the apology that would make everything make sense. She'd accepted that some people will never give you the closure you deserve, and you have to create it for yourself. Today, 5 years after that wedding night, Sarah is thriving. She and Marcus got married in a small ceremony with just a handful of close friends, people who'd proven their loyalty and honesty over time. There were no big guest lists, no church communities, no complicated family dynamics. Just the people who genuinely cared about them, celebrating a love built on transparency and trust. Sarah works as a counselor now, specializing in helping young adults who've aged out of the foster care system. She understands their unique struggles, their complicated relationships with the people who raised them, their difficulty trusting, their tendency to accept less than they deserve because they've been taught that any love is better than no love. She tells them her story when appropriate, not for sympathy, but to show them that survival is possible, that you can be betrayed by the people closest to you and still build a beautiful life. She teaches them what she had to learn the hard way, that you are not responsible for other people's feelings, that saying no is a complete sentence, that you deserve relationships where you don't have to constantly question whether you're being told the truth, that walking away from toxicity isn't giving up, it's choosing yourself. And she tells them something else, something she wishes someone had told her years ago. The people who are supposed to love you are supposed to make you feel safe, not confused. They're supposed to respect your boundaries, not make you feel guilty for having them. They're supposed to be consistent, not keep you constantly off balance trying to figure out where you stand. If the people in your life call themselves family, but make you feel anxious, manipulated, or small, you have permission to redefine what family means to you. Sarah still has hard days. Birthdays and holidays sometimes bring waves of grief for what she lost, not grief for Margaret or Daniel, but grief for the innocence she had before that night, for the uncomplicated trust she used to be capable of. She has moments where she questions whether she was too harsh, whether she should have tried harder to understand, whether forgiveness would have brought her more peace than distance did. But then she remembers Jennifer's words, "I spent 2 years wondering if I was crazy." Don't let them make you doubt your reality. And she remembers her own wisdom, hard-earned through therapy and time. Trust is earned, not owed. And once someone has shown you they're willing to deceive you for their own benefit, believing they won't do it again isn't trust. It's just hope. And hope is not a strategy for protecting yourself. So when those doubts creep in, Sarah grounds herself in the facts. She reads her journal entries from those early days, the raw pain and confusion documented there. She reminds herself of the pattern, not just one mistake, but a deliberate, repeated pattern of manipulation. She remembers Jennifer and the other women who came forward, and she knows she made the right choice. Not the easy choice, but the right one. And here's what Sarah wants you to know, what she wishes she could tell every person who's struggling with whether to stay or leave, whether to forgive or protect themselves. You don't owe anyone your destruction. You don't owe them your silence. You don't owe them your continued presence in their life just because they want it or because leaving would be uncomfortable for them. You owe yourself honesty. You owe yourself safety. You owe yourself the chance to build a life where love doesn't hurt, where trust isn't a gamble, where family means something real. And if that means walking away from people who share your last name, or who raised you, or who once meant everything to you, then that's what it means. Your healing is more important than their comfort. Your truth is more important than their reputation. Your future is more important than their past claim on your loyalty. Those words, Sarah says, saved her life. Not physically, but emotionally. They gave her permission to stop carrying the weight of other people's choices. They freed her to build something new. So I'll ask you one final time. What would you do? If you opened a door on what should have been the happiest night of your life and saw your world crumble, would you have the strength to walk away? Would you believe the truth your eyes showed you? Or would you let others convince you that you misunderstood, that you were overreacting, that forgiveness was the answer? Would you be able to cut ties with someone who raised you, who you'd called family, who claimed every manipulation was actually love? Or would the fear of being alone, of starting over, of losing the only family you'd known, keep you locked in a lie? There's no wrong answer, as long as it's your answer, made from a place of clarity and self-respect. Sarah's story isn't a prescription for how everyone should handle betrayal. It's one woman's journey through the worst kind of deception and out the other side. It's proof that you can survive the unsurvivable, that you can lose everything you thought defined you and discover you're still standing, that you can be broken by people you loved and still learn to trust again, that you can walk through fire and come out refined, not destroyed. Her story matters. Your story matters. And if you're in the middle of your own betrayal, your own impossible choice, your own moment of deciding whether to stay or go, I hope Sarah's story gives you permission to choose yourself. Because you deserve a love that doesn't require you to ignore your instincts. You deserve a family that doesn't make you question reality. You deserve relationships where honesty is the baseline, not an exception. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think or feel or question, do me a favor. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Not to gossip, not to judge, but to remind them that they're not alone, that survival is possible, that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's sacred. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what this story made you think about. Subscribe so you never miss the stories we share here. Stories that don't just entertain, but challenge you. Stories that hold up a mirror and ask you to look honestly at your own life. Because the next story I'm going to tell you will shake you even more than this one. It's about a secret that was buried for 30 years, hidden under layers of family loyalty and small-town silence. A secret that, when it finally came to light, destroyed not just one relationship, but an entire family's understanding of who they were. A secret so devastating that the person who uncovered it said, "I wish I'd never looked. I wish I'd just believed the lie. The truth cost me everything." But she's glad she knows now. And after you hear her story, you'll understand why. So subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, remember, some doors reveal truths that change everything. And sometimes, walking through those doors, as painful as it is the only way to finally be free.